And so now we want to talk about some of the specific provisions beyond having a representative government that ensures that government officials will be able to do their jobs, but at the same time will not be able to abuse the power that they get there. And so, as I said before, these are provisions that any type of study of the US Constitution will emphasize. And so whichever version of these are the provisions that you need to know. And so they're bolded on this slide. So they are the idea of separation of powers, checks and balances, limited government, federalism, Bill of Rights, and the difficulty to amend the US Constitution. And so you need to understand both the larger ideas of why this is put into place, but also some of the details about those. And so we want you to recognize and understand how the separation of powers works, checks and balances work, limited government, federalism, Bill of Rights, and the difficulty to amend the US Constitution. And this is something that you may get from reading the textbook and paying attention to the way in which I describe these things. So really make sure that the details make sense in addition to those larger provisions and the larger ideas behind it. So, starting with the first idea is the idea of the separation. The framers of the US Constitution said what we need to do is to be able to take the power of government, that this power the national government has is considerably more than it had under the Articles of Confederation. And so we worry about the ability of government officials, an individual official, or a whole branch of government from have. And so they said the one way of doing that is to separate the powers. If you separate the powers so that each branch is a specialist in a particular aspect of things the government does, or that the only way for the government to work is for all three branches to work. But it creates that the other two branches will be watchers doing. And so the separation of powers is the idea of having a legislative branch, an executive branch, and a judicial branch. The legislative branch is the branch of government. It's made up of the House of Representatives and the US Senate. So if you recognize, they take that one branch and divide that even more. It's an indication that the framers of the US Constitution thought that even though there were three co-equal branches, they would all have power in the system of government, the legislative branch was meant to be the most important. Legislative supremacy. It was meant to be that even though all three branches were co-equal in terms of the respect they should have, it is the legislative branch that is meant to be the engine of our system of government. And that makes a lot of sense because it is the argument that they are the ones that are the core idea of representative government are elected, at least part of it, the House of Representatives, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But the idea is that the legislative branch is meant to have the most power. The executive branch and the judicial branch certainly mattered, but they wouldn't have as much power in terms of the overall power of the government. So the legislative branch writes the laws. The executive branch is responsible for taking those laws and putting them into motion to, as the terminology is, they administer the laws, they execute the law. The part is the judicial branch. Because there will be some disagreements about how the law is being implemented, whether or not that law violates other parts of the US Constitution, whether that law violates other parts of the law, whether or not a particular situation is a complete violation of a law that is written, there are going to be some discussions about those things, and it adjudicates when there are areas of conflict. And so those are the three branches of government. You have the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. And each one is responsible for doing those activities. So you take the power of the government and you divide it into the three separate areas. The next system that's in place is a system of checks and balances. The framers also added in that even though you would separate the powers, the legislative branch would write the laws, the executive branch would administer those laws, and the judicial branch would deal with any problems that would come up and adjudicate between those among and between those conflicts. The system of checks and balances said there would be some overlap, so that you would have branches directly watching what the other branches were doing. The most obvious system of checks and balances is that even though it is the legislative branch that writes the laws, it is also the case that the President of the United States, who's in the executive branch, who heads the executive branch, has the ability to veto legislation. So in that sense, the president has a legislative role to play, because the bill does not become a law until the president signs it. And if the president vetoes the bill, it is not a law, even though the legislative branch has actually voted in favor of it. So that's one example of a check that the executive branch has on the legislative branch. But there is a check on that check even. So the framers got into some complicated issues. And that is that the legislative branch, if they can override the veto of the President of the United States, it takes a 2/3 majority instead of a simple majority. It is an indication that what they need is to be certain that they want to override the president's no vote on this. But if so, they can override, and that becomes a legislative check on the executive check of being able to veto. Um, but there are examples, all three branches have ways of checking the power of the other. So, for example, the executive branch certainly has a legislative branch by vetoing. But the judicial branch also has an ability to check the power of the legislative branch and the executive branch by being able to declare acts of Congress or decisions taken by the president as unconstitutional. And so the judicial branch can say, I don't care if the majority of the House, the majority of the Senate, and the President of the United States signed off on this and they want this bill to become law, we can actually rule that unconstitutional. That what the legislative branch and the executive branch want is unconstitutional in our viewpoint, and therefore that bill becomes null and void. It will not actually exist anymore. So that's a considerable power that the judicial branch has over the legislative branch and the executive branch. You have other ways in which the legislative branch can watch what the executive branch is doing, the judicial branch is doing. So the legislative branch has the ability to confirm appointments to the president's cabinet. So the head of the different administrative parts of the executive branch, the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of Agriculture, is appointed by the president but must be confirmed by a majority vote of the U.S. Senate. And so the legislative branch has some say over who is going to head the departments in the executive branch. Similarly, appointments to the judicial branch are actually a shared balance. So members of the judicial branch are chosen by the President of the United States and then confirmed by a majority vote of the U.S. Senate. So in that sense, the putting on of who the justice is going to be is decided co-equally by the President and the U.S. Senate. And so there are a number of these, and the textbook points out some of these as well. But it's important to recognize that the system of checks and balances means that there are ways in which the entire branch can watch what another branch is doing. A sharing of power in the sense of shared roles. And so the president does not serve as the Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. The president is not the head of the House of Representatives or anything like that. Instead, there is an overlap in terms of the jobs that are done. There is one small point in which there is an official in the executive branch who plays an official legislative role, and it's almost the exception that proves the rule, and that is if there is a tie in the U.S. Senate, because there are 2 senators for every state, ties were possible. You have 50% plus 1 or greater, you cannot have a tie. Ties must be broken by a vote of the vice president. But that is the only time that you have an official in one branch actually playing a role in the other branch. And so this system of checks and balances is allowing the branches to watch each other, but the separation of powers still exists. The next one is the idea of limited government. The idea of limited is the idea that the national government would have jobs that it would do, very different than the Articles of Confederation. Under the Articles of Confederation, the jobs that the national government would do would be decided by the states themselves. If 9 of 13 agreed for the national government to do something, then the national government could do those things. And the state governments could change their mind over time. But in the system we have under the US Constitution, instead, the national government is given its jobs in the Constitution. And that's described in Article 1, Section 8. So another indication that the framers thought that the legislative branch should have legislative supremacy within our system, that it is meant to be the most powerful branch of the 3 branches, is that's the idea of the powers of the national government are described in Article 1. Article 1 is the description of what the legislative branch can do. And so in Article 1, Section 8, which, since you read the Constitution, you've taken a look at, and you should take a look at again, lays out the powers of the national government, and they're listed there. They include the ability to declare war, printing money, coming up with the systems of weights and measures. A whole list of things is listed in Article 1, Section 8 and says the national government does these things. The other thing that it is given, and this is an important change from under the Articles of Confederation, is that the national government is given the ability to regulate interstate commerce. So it is hoping to create a power for the national government to be able to talk about how trade and economic activity is going to exist between the states, because the states themselves can't actually be responsible for those things. But in laying this out in jobs that the national government is going to have, it was a change from the Articles of Confederation. Another system that's in the US Constitution is the idea of federalism. We'll talk about more specifically in the next chapter, but federalism is a sharing of power where the national government does certain things and the state governments do other things. And so the idea of federalism is that the national government would take the lead on certain issues, and then the state governments would take the lead on other ones. And as we're going to be talking about, it sounds easy to divide the world into two states where the national government would deal with these things that the framers called great and aggregate interests, and the states would do local and particular ones. But in reality, it's much harder to do that. It's harder because we can see that issues kind of blend into each other, and it's hard to know, is this a great and aggregate interest, or is this a local and particular? Actually, a focus that we're going to talk about when we talk about federalism. But the idea of having a system where you have some power that's given to the national government, some power is given to the state governments, you recognize that the national government is going to make sure that the states don't undermine the decisions made by the national government, and the state governments are going to be very, very concerned if the national government comes in and tries to take more power away from them. And so that creates this system where the idea is that the state governments could recognize or believe that the national government is abusing its power. The next aspect of the US Constitution that's protecting against abuse by government officials is the Bill of Rights. It prohibits specifically the national government from restricting important individual freedoms. And we've gone over those before, but it's worth thinking about that. It includes in the First Amendment speech, petition, assembly, freedom of religion, but it also includes things like no illegal search and seizure, no cruel and unusual punishment, a right to a speedy trial. All of these things are going to restrict the national government from abusing those individual liberties. And so that was an important provision. As we talked about, the framers said we don't really need this because we have separation of powers, checks and balances, limited government, federalism. All of those things means we don't have to list those liberties that are protected. At the end of the day, the framers lost that battle, and the Bill of Rights was added because the states demanded it. And finally, if this system works, checks and balances, limited government, federalism, Bill of Rights, if all of those work to make sure the national government doesn't have too much authority, doesn't abuse its power, then the system change that easily. And so the difficulty to amend the US Constitution is meant as a way to protect against abuse by government officials. And so you have that the voting rules make it very difficult to do. So you have to propose amendments to the US Constitution. It takes 2/3 of Congress or 2/3 of the states to propose changes to the US Constitution, but to ratify them, to make them official, to change the US Constitution, takes 3/4 of the states and the states alone in order to ratify those. And so what we can see is a system, again, of different branches or different parts of the government being able to make it. So the national government can propose changes if it wants. So if 2/3 of the House and the Senate decide to want to change the Constitution in a particular way, they can bring amendments. But it will take the states to ratify those. So it's a system of federalism that we can see in the amendment process. The state governments themselves can propose and amend constitutions on their own if they want to. So they could, 2/3 of the states could call for changes to the US Constitution, and 3/4 of the states could then change the Constitution if they want. And so it's an indication, again, that the US Constitution was an outgrowth of the Articles of Confederation, where the states had considerable amount of power. But it is a system of federalism because all of the amendments that have been proposed up until now have been done by the national government. The route that has been used has been the national government has proposed amendments and then ratified by 3/4 of the states. But the main point is that if you have, it takes 2/3 to propose and 3/4 to ratify, then in fact it's not going to change that much. And if the system is working the way that it should to make sure the government officials can't abuse their power, then the framers have been successful, they would argue, in making sure that the system was set up that way.